Ladies and gentlemen, Coda, first of all, let me say what a delight and honour it is for me to address this important RUSI conference here in Tokyo, and also pay a tribute to those that have made it possible and organised it. I'd also like immediately to pay tribute to Coda for an erudite, insightful presentation. And what delights me is it doesn't cross with anything that I've said, so I don't need to adjust my speech. And I have one piece of advice for you: never let anybody see your speech before the event. I stand here today at this conference, having, of course, as mentioned, only recently retired as the head of the Royal Navy. I'm not here as the warm-up act to my successor, who is coming in December, and whose arrival was advertised so thoroughly by your Prime Minister. During my time as the First Sea Lord, it was indeed a distinct pleasure for me to spend a very short period in early spring of 2011 here in Japan as the guest of the then Chief of Staff Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, Admiral Masahiko Sugimoto. And an even greater pleasure for me to reciprocate and host Admiral Sugimoto in London the following year. My dinner on board the Mikasa, a ship built in Barrow-in-Furness, United Kingdom, and so predominant in the Russo-Japanese War, is an enduring reminder to me of the close historic maritime ties between our two nations, mentioned by a number of speakers earlier this afternoon. Now, there's always much pomp and show and hospitality associated with such visits, but primarily these visits are about getting to know personally your counterpart, exchanging frank views and perspectives, and looking for opportunities for mutual benefit. Such high-level visits, therefore, have real substance. Masahiko and I were, I think, highly successful in this, both here and in the UK the following year, and it is on the credentials of that close relationship and openness established then that I make my remarks today. Now, much has already been said about the closeness of our historic and economic ties, our common values, and our common fervent belief in a strong, rules-based international system. We are both island nations, dependent on sea trade and the security of that trade to our national prosperity and well-being. The recent interim report of your Defence Posture Review seems to me to have many parallels with the UK's 2011 Defence and Security Review, and I believe we have some notes to swap here. I will expand on this a little later. And the July high-level agreements between our two nations set us fair for much closer defence engagement and cooperation. In the light of this new momentum, if you like, my remit this afternoon is to say a few words on the current and future scope of our military maritime cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region and the importance of the maritime component therein. Now, many here are better qualified than I to give a detailed account of the major strategic issues that affect both short and long-term security in this part of the world. Pauline and Professor Morimoto have indeed already done so. Let me simply highlight again a few strategic maritime issues as I perceive them. The explosion of growth over the last decade across the majority of nations of this region has resulted in an exponential rise in the international community's interest in all that goes on here. Economic and industrial power, alongside commodity and raw material dependency, growing military might, boundary disputes, and unlimited connectivity ensures the continued attention of the West and the industrialised world. And as mentioned by the Prime Minister, with global shipping routes now encompassing the Arctic seas as well, and with Japan at the eastern gateway of those seas, and Europe at the western gateway of those seas, a new dynamic awaits with maritime security connotations that really have yet to be fully studied. Now, the pivoting of US power, as President Obama puts it, to the Pacific Rim much discussed already, is profound, but not only for this region. The wider consequences in the NATO area, i.e. the Atlantic area, are equally significant. And since long-term security structures and equipment requirements for Europe nations are involved, they could well require some reassessment into the future if the pivot is substantial. There is only so much US military power to go around in this uncertain world, and where one area gains, another could fall short. This is starkly exposed today by the insecurities of the Middle East and the difficult balance of US military effort associated with it. And now Obama's reasoning to pivot is nonetheless very clear, that the growing economic importance of the Pacific Rim and the USA's continued responsibilities for the security of this region as a consequence of their treaty obligations and their own national security interests necessitate some prioritization of their not limitless military and diplomatic resources. China's continued investment in its military, particularly the modernization of the PLA Navy, should first, I think, be seen as a natural extension of its growing economic status. Beijing was very clear in 2004 that the PLA Navy should be prepared to operate in non-traditional areas such as international peacekeeping operations, humanitarian assistance, and counter-terrorism. As it operates now in distant seas and in its own home waters, this expansion and modernization presents considerable opportunities to enhance maritime cooperation, helping build trust and understanding between different navies and their associated nations. Exercising with the Chinese Naval Task Group within the counter-piracy operations in the Indian Ocean is an excellent example of this. However, China's naval modernization also presents significant challenges. The subliminal message being sent by some elements of their new equipment program and underpinned by open source published strategy are of counter-intervention and distant seas defense, with pronouncements on territorial seas at odds with many of their neighbors. Such terms and statements are understandably seen by many as confrontational rather than defensive. There are mixed messages here. There is much intellectual debate, but the reality is real tension and the occasional moment of crisis. Now, the most pressing security issue with your neighbor is over the disputed islands, of which the Senkakus are, of course, the most prominent. I remember well the lengthy briefing I received when I visited in 2001, and Admiral Sugimoto and his team sat me down and introduced me to a new term, lawfare as opposed to warfare. Here, the principal battles are over differing legal interpretation of the facts. Whilst the UK takes no position on these disputes, the opportunities for miscalculation are worrying, especially as the consequences of these tensions play out at sea. The UK continues to urge for resolution that is in line with international maritime law. It would certainly not wish to see a departure from the UNCLOS principles. Now, from the UK's wider point of view, as a fundamentally trading nation and with a seat on the UN Security Council, it knows it must continue to be outward-facing in its international engagement. We have significant investment and wider interests in this particular region, and our future prosperity is linked to what goes on here. Our continued security ties to this part of the world are formalised in the UK's direct involvement in or observer status within FPDA, ASEAN, RECAP, NATO, or the EU frameworks. We strive to do more, for example, to gain observer status to the Western Pacific Naval Symposium. Let me now turn to the core of my address and the contribution that maritime power takes or makes in this region, and more broadly to its security and prosperity agenda. You might find it surprising to hear me say this, but for the last 300 years, we in the UK have been able to economically prosper through trading under the watchful and powerful eye of a powerful Royal Navy. This is still the case. But regrettably, we are now a nation where it is a challenge to get an understanding of the importance of the maritime to our nation's prosperity and security agendas. Pauline, thank you very much indeed for your helpful comments. Our population is what I call somewhat sea blind. They view the sea as no more than that bit of blue that they fly over in aeroplanes en route to their holidays. It is important to engage your nation in its maritime history and the importance of its maritime to its prosperity and security agenda. Now, I don't think that is the case here in Japan. I returned home from my visit to your country in 2011, 3 days before the Great East Japan earthquake. Pauline's already mentioned this, but we in the UK helped where we could, and we watched with huge admiration the outstanding recovery work done by all your emergency services and the National Self-Defence Forces. Whilst the sea was the ultimate foe, the support provided by the Maritime Self-Defence Force was clearly a major enabler, amongst others, to your recovery efforts. I pay tribute to what you did and trust the positive spin-off has resulted in a more maritime-aware population. Now, this is an example of maritime's contribution to what is termed smart power. We've already heard smart power twice in the presentations. I'd like to be clear about what my interpretation of smart power is. Smart power is the ability to employ both soft power, for example, diplomacy, and hard power, for example, kinetic strike, effectively utilising all of the levers that a nation has to pull to produce more enduring outcomes to crises. What the Navy does every day, and by that I'm talking the Royal Navy, but I think it is a generic term, is part of the smart power delivered by our respective nations. Why do I say that? Because our respective navies are busy at sea delivering a presence both at home and across the world in areas of national interest, thereby producing the following strategic effects: international reassurance, capability building both of our own but also our partner, coalition or alliance nations, navies, collaborating wherever we can with both partners and new friends as we find them. We're promoting collective security across the globe where we can. And finally, we act as a deterrent to those who would contemplate doing us harm. As I stated in RUSI London last year, it is the capacity of maritime power to deliver these effects in very nuanced ways that makes it the epitome of smart power. And because the delivery of smart power places a premium on prevention, which I think we would all agree is the ultimate prize in any national security strategy, it means what we do is really quite important. Excellent and relevant examples of this high-level effect is the visit by the Japanese training squadron to Portsmouth, England in July of this year, and the pending visit of the destroyer HMS Daring to Japan later this year, and again mentioned by the Prime Minister. Goodwill, exercise opportunities, capacity building, greater understanding of the way we do our business, and strong international signals of unity are the results. But there's even more than this. Navies need to be forward deployed, at sea, and ready. Only by having persistent presence in areas of national interest can navies deliver maritime power and the effects I've highlighted on a persistent basis. In so doing, they maintain confidence in the sea trade upon which we depend, build trust with an ever-expanding circle of international partners, bring reassurance to fragile states, prevent the consequences of illegal activities reaching our shores, and act as a deterrent to potential aggressors from challenging our national interests. Again, as I said last year, The more we deploy, the less we're likely to have to be kinetic. And I emphasize again the words persistent presence, which is the ability to remain on station and have seamless rotation of assets, to keep our assets on station for as long as the crisis or such like might require. And it's not only just about being at sea, it's about being at readiness to get to sea. It's about the ability to react swiftly with the right capabilities and the ability to respond across the whole spectrum of uncertainty. For the Royal Navy, a consequence of the Strategic Defence and Security Review of 2011 was the creation of what we call the Response Force Task Group, or RFTG. This is a highly capable, quick reaction force consisting of ships, aircraft and marines, suited to a wide range of defence tasks, from maritime strike to disaster relief, and from amphibious operations to civilian evacuation. Clearly, when the new Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carriers are commissioned later this decade, the capabilities they will provide will significantly enhance the RFTG strike power and wider utility. But let me be clear about a few things. The RFTG is principally a defence asset. It could work alone or form the core of a wider joint defence response to crisis, and indeed will always depend on many key joint enablers to conduct its operations. It could also form part of the UK's contribution to any combined international military response, be that a coalition or alliance or just a single bilateral requirement. It also will remain an asset with global reach. We will use it to provide the effects I've discussed, doing business wherever and whenever the politicians might choose to use us, and indeed where they might choose to send us. It is currently deployed east of Suez. Let me return to the concept of readiness, since it's not only about speed of response, it equally concerns that spectrum of tasking I mentioned. Indeed, our ability to be smart is a function of matching the spectrum of uncertainty with the spectrum of capabilities that we have at our disposal. After all, smart power is only as effective as the range of hard and soft power options it has at its disposal. Now, I recognise that we're talking about all the levers of national power here, but in the maritime component, like all others, it's about maintaining the greatest range of capabilities and thereby political and military options. For the maritime, I mean capabilities that enable the required effects both at sea and from the sea. Constabulary capabilities, absolutely, but high-end warfighting too. Of course, if you can get the latter, you can by implication do the former. Now, the balancing of arguments, both strategic and economic, between technical edge over an adversary and the number of ships available to deal with everyday activity, as well as being ready for the unexpected, I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, is the bread and butter of daily business of a Chief of Navy. And it's very difficult. I would, of course, advocate the winning qualities that state-of-the-art equipment brings to a force. But such cutting-edge capability comes at a cost. And in the maritime, that frequently means fewer ships. And however capable a given platform is, it can only be in one place at one time. In the state-of-the-art Type 45 destroyer, the Daring class, for example, 80% of the new build was new cutting-edge technology, both in propulsion and weapon systems. It came at quite a cost, and platform numbers reductions resulted. Ultimately, though, we must remember that effective prevention is about credible deterrence. Of course, we need to respond to the most likely, but we must also be able to try and deter, or as a last resort, successfully respond to the most dangerous. Our navies both need to present very cogent arguments to our politicians to ensure their full understanding of the implications of their decision-making and future investment requirements. Now, returning to the title of this presentation, I am asked to crystal ball gaze and put forward the prospects for future UK-Japanese cooperation within the maritime area. Let me start by saying there is much to celebrate already. Our annual naval staff talks are the vehicle for active collaboration in all areas where common requirements are perceived. The exchange of ideas in this forum are wide-ranging and, importantly, very frank. Our work together in the Indian Ocean, spoken about a great deal this afternoon, and in the vicinity of the Gulf, a common interest in maritime security more generally, and freedom of navigation, and the prospect of significant defence industrial cooperation already underpin those Navy-to-Navy relationships. Another example is with a common airframe in the Merlin helicopter, an affiliation between 829 Naval Air Squadron and 111 Squadron Joint Maritime Self-Defence Forces has dynamically assisted in ironing out some of the common operational and technical difficulties that we both experienced with that airframe. Again, the UK's National Maritime Information Centre is working through the Regional Cooperation Agreement on Combined Piracy and Armed Robbery Against Ships, recap, utilising the Information Sharing Centre based in Singapore as its hub. Much greater national and global maritime situation awareness is the prize in being part of this organisation. I understand you're also very much involved in creating this wider situational awareness. As I've already said, I read with interest your Defence Posture Review's interim report. There is, I believe, much fertile ground here for closer collaboration in a number of areas. Whilst, of course, I now have no responsibility or say in making these things happen, the following shopping list of opportunities does stand out. It's much more practical than the points raised earlier, but I think all need consideration alongside Vice Admiral Coda's points. Firstly, the United Kingdom has been addressing the challenge associated with joint structures for a number of years, not only to meet the realities of joint operations, but also the realities, the financial savings that can result bring along. The creation in the 2011 Strategic Defence and Security Review of a Joint Forces Command led at 4-star level is our next bold step. Sharing the details of the joint journey we have been on with you will provide useful insights. The maritime has a huge amount to gain here, since maritime power instinctively understands integration of joint capabilities to deliver joint effect. It's how we do our business. Next, working even more closely with your deployed units is important, especially as the envelope of your constitutional constraints evolve. In the Indian Ocean, working with CTF 151 on counter-piracy is a golden opportunity to improve the interoperability of both of our maritime forces. Your desire expressed in the posture review for closer collaboration with NATO will have substance by growing closer links with individual NATO nations beyond the US. The UK could, I think, be very much involved here. Pauline already discussed and put forward issues associated with cyber defence and attack. This is a vital area and a wonderful opportunity for much closer collaboration. And I say that with the joint defence hat on as much as I do in the maritime context. But we have common threats, common issues to deal with, and we should take this forward. I think we have similar challenges in the human resources area as well. Recruitment and retention of our skilled workforce is ever more difficult as the younger generation seek more flexible, less disciplined employment. The Navy is, in particular, with long periods of separation as a matter of course, is particularly challenged by the modern ideas of youth. Current branch and rank structures are also creaking. We need many more technical expertise, much more technical expertise in our workforce than in the past, with consequently more chief petty officers than sailors. But how do we grow them when you've got an inverted pyramid of requirement? I know that we would love to see if you're facing the same challenges and how we could address some of these issues collectively. Minesweeping area has already been mentioned. It's non-contentious. We have a big history of collaboration in this area, and I do think there's much more to take forward in this arena. Another area, I think, although I was told at lunch that it is actually moving forward, is that during the height of the Cold War, a maritime agreement was struck between the US, UK, and the then Soviet Union to formalize arrangements when our ships met with each other at sea to prevent crisis arising as a result of miscalculation. It served all sides extremely well during the Cold War, and in these less tense times continues as a vehicle for annual exercises between all the nations, now including France. A model for you to assess, I would suggest, to reduce the tensions you may face with some of your neighbours. I've already highlighted the need for cutting-edge technologies to give us both a winning edge. I think we would all agree that it is less expensive to do this in collaboration. We are similar-sized navies and have similar requirements. There is much to be gained in this, I think. I'd add that in this particular area, of course, the challenges associated particularly with the three principles legislation does need to be looked at very carefully, but that's for others to discuss. And I'd add another in terms of this, which is whilst one looks at this collaboration in terms of real outputs, in terms of capabilities, actually R&D budgets are reducing dramatically in those nations stretched in military funding. And it's R&D that's allowed us to be where we are today in investment 20, 30 years ago. I mean, to make sure we have the same technical edge in the future, we've got to make sure we invest collectively in R&D, and there's an area where work should be done, I would suggest. And finally, there is scope for more collaboration on doctrinal and conceptual development, and indeed general information exchange across the piece. Because if we can achieve closer links with staff colleges and warfare centres, we could achieve much broader mindsets and allow workshops to generate many more ideas than I can put forward here. Let me conclude. The White Ensign might be a little more obvious in Japan waters, in Japanese waters this year than of late with the planned visit of HMS Daring. But the reality is that the Royal Navy is particularly busy, even stretched, by its commitments to the Gulf and Atlantic regions at the moment, limiting its ability to regularly deploy assets into this region. But we do, of course, are deploying assets into areas of common interest, which was already covered. This should not, I would suggest, be seen and does not mean that there is no substance to our maritime cooperation. It's not just about white ensigns in Japanese waters. Much goes on already, and there are a number of meaningful avenues for close collaboration between our respective navies, all of which are huge value added to both nations. All deserve scrutiny. I've named but a few. Our talented attachés, naval staff talks, and high-level policy gatherings have some work to do, I would suggest. I'm an admiral, so I'm bound to be biased towards the maritime. But I contend that maritime power integrates nations, especially island trading nations, best. This is because our shared global commons drives a very common purpose. We should, as like-minded nations, work hard to maximise this effect. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience.